delighted to say, is a good friend of mine who has worked inside Number 10 and knows how that curious place behind her works better than many people I know. It's Joanne Nadler, and great to see you. You've been listening, I know, a little bit to what Priti Patel and Yvette Cooper were saying, and those interventions from quite high up the food chain, people like David Davis and Theresa May. But what do you sense will be the atmosphere and the dynamics in the House of Commons when the PM gets up, eyeballs Sir Keir Starmer and knows that the men and women who have his fate in their hands are sitting behind him? What will that be like?
Well, I think perhaps perversely it may not be as bad for the Prime Minister as it might have been a couple of hours ago before the news broke about this intervention from Sir Keir and the prospect of a vote, I believe, on Thursday regarding maybe referring the Prime Minister to the Common Standards Committee. Yeah. And I think
Joanne,
what happens in the Conservative benches...
Forgive me for interrupting. Merely to clarify between ourselves, for folk who are kind enough to be listening to our conversation on radio or on television, and that was the judgment, because we ran it at the top of the programme, but that is the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Keir, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, granting a debate, but on Thursday, on whether or not the Prime Minister should be referred to the Committee on Standards over Partygate, and that was moved by Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, but granted by Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House of Commons. That's the only reason I interrupted, Joanne.
No, that's absolutely fine. And yes, you're right. I mean, that's what I'm referring to. And I think that may have an effect that perhaps Sir Keir wasn't planning on for the backbenchers on the Conservative side, because when they see an existential threat to the party, when they see a threat posed by the other side, if you like, they do tend to pull together. So I think it's now going to be more difficult in a way for those criticisms and those critics of the Prime Minister to come forward.
Can I put something else to you as a very experienced chess player when it comes to the game of politics? It just struck me that having Priti Patel versus Yvette Cooper on Rwanda, which is contentious within the Conservative Party and contentious within the country, was not a bad idea either. That also takes some of the venom out of the atmosphere, because people like David Davis, Theresa May, Andrew Mitchell can have a good go on that and then clear the decks for the Prime Minister's statement.
Well, that would have been a very shrewd bit of parliamentary planning for the afternoon, yes. But I think there's also another aspect to highlighting that debate this afternoon, and that's for the Prime Minister to be able to say to his backbenchers, look, we are now doing something in a material sense, regardless of how controversial it may be in some quarters, but we're doing something about an issue that has been causing great concern to many of those voters that Boris Johnson has been particularly successful with in terms of his ability to reach out beyond the Conservative Party's natural constituency. So I think in a way he's trying to bolster his role, his specific role as leader of the Conservative Party. And perhaps to remind
totally agree with you. And going back to the era when we, as it were, we first knew each other, the John Major era, and John faced his difficulties. He went into the Rose Garden at Number 10 and addressed people like John Redwood and the Flapping Coat Brigade, as he referred to them on Brexit, and basically said, put up or shut up. What Boris Johnson seems to be saying is, I'm the guy to see this through. I'm going to see through immigration. I'm going to see through the economy. I'm even going over to India to try and do stuff. Leave me where I am. I've work still to do.
Absolutely. And in a sense, that is the better part of his defence. I think this sort of slightly mealy-mouthed attempt to defend him on the basis that he didn't necessarily know that something was a party or wasn't a party actually doesn't really wash. It doesn't hold a great deal of authenticity to it, even if it may actually be true. It just doesn't sound terribly convincing. So I think what the Prime Minister is right to do is to really position himself as this world leader and as the only leader now in the sights of the Conservative Party. After all, over the last few days, we've seen his main potential rival, Rishi Sunak, really rather blow up his own chances, I think, of being able to effortlessly walk in as the alternative leader. So Conservative Party members, Conservative Party MPs will be facing the reality that if they do hasten the departure of Boris Johnson, what then happens? What comes next?
Absolutely fascinating. One of the other bits of the defence, and whether he says it in the next 10, 15 minutes or not, we don't know, because curiously there haven't even been those secret squirrel briefings from Number 10, which we're both familiar of. Even on the morning of the budget, secret squirrel briefings go on. Nothing on the content of it, other than simply the guidance. It will be similar to his apology interview that he gave on the night that he was fined. But the suggestion that he will make hay over the war that is raging within Ukraine, that struck me as being one trick that wasn't that clever, in the sense that everybody in the House of Commons, whether it is Ed Davey for the Liberal Democrats or Keir Starmer for Labour, have said, look, we all stand four square behind supporting Ukraine. It's not a Boris Johnson policy, it's a House of Commons policy.
I think that's right. I think it's very important that if the Prime Minister does invoke the war in Ukraine, that his use of language, his tone is very measured, because I think it could slightly rebound on him in a negative way if he's appearing to try to use this in a political way.
Yep.
And I think that would be inappropriate.
Yes, I agree with that. Joanne, hold that thought for a moment. My director has just told me that Sir Keir Starmer, so let's just cut back visually, if you're kind enough to be watching us on television, and if you're listening to us on radio, we'll talk you through it. But can we cut up the House of Commons now? So that folk watching on television can see that. Joanne is still there. Lynn's still here with me in the studio. So that's the scene in the House of Commons. That's the Labour side. The reason we did that is to say that Sir Keir Starmer has now arrived and will be there. That's Priti Patel just pretty well finishing off, looking across at the Labour members of Parliament, with Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister, sitting to her right. And we will cut to that live with audio as well the moment the Prime Minister gets up. But just to let you know that Sir Keir Starmer has now arrived and is in his place to respond to whatever the Prime Minister has to say. Joanne, is there anything fresh that Sir Keir can say? Because he's already done the bit, why is he still there? That line we've heard more times than I've had hot cross buns at Prime Minister's questions. Is there anything fresh in Sir Keir's armoury?
Well, the Conservative Party, of course, will be hoping that there isn't, and the potential for freshness might come over the next few days and weeks, depending on what is in the Sue Gray report and whether or not the Prime Minister has to pay any more fixed penalty notice fines. But as to what he can say or do this afternoon, I mean, not that I want to give him any advice, but I think, his strongest territory really is on this issue about, people who make laws shouldn't be breaking laws, and the fact that so many members of the public were deprived the most basic human rights, really, during the lockdown period. They weren't able to attend funerals. They weren't able to visit elderly and sickly relatives in care homes. And I think that, for him to focus on that in juxtaposition to the fact that parties were going on in Number 10, whether or not the Prime Minister knew exactly all the details, that to me is really his strongest suit.
Yeah. Will they have played war games on this in Number 10? You've been there when similar situations have pertained, as we all know that they do before PMQs. Starmer's likely to say this and the SNP are likely to say that, and the Lib Dems, if they get called, are likely to say X, Y and Z. And one of the points they might play on war games...
Well, if they're doing their job properly.
Well, okay, it'd be a bit tricky if they didn't. But I'm going to stick my neck out and say I think everybody now knows that many people suffered during the lockdown and that many people weren't able to attend funerals and even final moments with people. The cynical bit of me says we know all of that, and that hasn't cut through yet, and it's not going to cut through now.
Well, I think that I still think it's the strongest suit that he has in terms of what he says this afternoon. It is this point about rules were broken by people who were making those rules. It's one rule for them, it's one rule for us. And I do think that from Labour's point of view, that particular mantra, it's one rule for them, it's one rule for us, is actually pretty strong. Not least because, it has a very strong air of authenticity about it, but, focused on this subject.
All right. Joanne, you stay right where you are, and I'm telling you and also the people who are kind enough to listen to our conversation or watch it here on telly that Priti Patel is just drawing her remarks to a conclusion. So plug in the earpiece and make sure you can hear exactly what the Prime Minister and Sir Keir are saying.